Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Today on CityCast Philly, it's the Friday News Roundup. We're talking about the big stories this week. SEPTA funding is in limbo. Is it because legislators from other parts of the state don't like us? Or maybe they're just mad because Wawa just beat Sheetz in a national survey. And finally, instead of widening highways, should we be building more subway lines? It's Friday, October 4th. I'm Trinae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. So before we get started on the news this week, we got to talk about how Wawa has been named the best convenience store in the country when it comes to customer satisfaction. That's according to a recent survey from the American Customer Satisfaction Index, which surveys American consumers. Notably, though, Wawa beat Pennsylvania rival Sheetz. Lauren Vitas, a government and political consultant and the owner of Enact Strategies, and Jay Arzu, doctoral candidate in urban planning at the University of Pennsylvania, who's writing his dissertation on the proposed Roosevelt Boulevard subway. I gotta ask y'all, do you agree with the survey respondents? Is Wawa better than Sheetz? Are you getting good customer service with your shorties?
I'm a firm believer in Wawa over Sheetz supremacy, but I think that probably stems from the fact that I am a born and bred Philadelphian. Yeah, I will say, I think Wawa is still king of the mountain, but it's definitely fallen off a couple notches. I think when they switched over from the golf pencils and pads where you would write your sandwich overs to the touch screens, we lost something, but I'll take Wawa over Sheetz any day.
Yeah, I have a lot of love for Sheetz. Great food.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I will say that Wawa, has a special place in my heart. I think about the late night studying and, getting Wawa on South Street on the way home.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of love for Wawa. And I will, agree with Lauren and say that I feel that Wawa has somewhat fell off a little bit, but, I still got a lot of love for them. And I hope they continue to improve, but I don't care too much for the pizza.
I was just going to say, once they started doing like dinner at 4 p.m., I was like, wait, hold up.
Mission creep. You can't have mission creep.
Those fries aren't like crispy as they should be. Okay, so we're going to get into some of the big news stories this week. Time is running out for the state government to fund SEPTA, now running a $240 million operating deficit. The Pennsylvania House of Representatives, controlled by Democrats, passed a plan from the governor that would send $161 million to SEPTA. But now the plan is facing opposition in the state Senate. Lauren, can you give us kind of like the lay of the land here? What has to happen for this money to get released for our transit system?
Sure. I mean, I think a couple things have to happen. The first sort of context to note is that this conversation is happening outside of the typical budget process. So this is sort of a standalone issue, which in a way is good because everybody's kind of focused on, the solution to this one problem. But the negative is that it takes a lot of the leverage that the governor and the House Democrats might otherwise have in budget negotiations off the table. I think what needs to happen is something that, we see fairly typically when we're talking about these types of issues, which is overcoming that rural urban divide. So for Philadelphia, our transit system is the lifeblood of our economy. If people can't get to work, if kids can't get to school, it impacts every aspect of day-to-day life in Philadelphia. This is not an issue that folks who live in Elk County or, Beaver County are facing.
Right. They don't care. Right.
I wouldn't even say they don't care. I think it's just not something that, that it's not top of mind because it's not their lived experience. But they have bridges that are are falling down, roads that are getting washed away, things like that. So what I think is going to need to happen is two things. Number one, the Republicans and Democrats are going to need to agree that transportation needs to be funded. And number two, they're going to have to agree on a funding source. And I think we can get everybody to agree that we need to spend money on maintaining our roads and maintaining bus lines and trains and things like that. I think the heavier lift is going to be identifying a funding source that is robust enough to address both these issues. And I think that's where the attention is going to lie.
When's the deadline here?
It's not a deadline per se. So it's not like, as I said, it's not the budget process where, the fiscal year ends June 30th.
Right.
The deadline is really, when does SEPTA have to begin to cut services? When does SEPTA have to, they've announced that they're going to eliminate, the key card discount. They announced that there will be fare hikes. And as Leslie Richards has pointed out, cutting services and raising fares is going to cause what is known as like a death spiral, because the more expensive it is, the less frequently the system runs, the fewer people that use it, which means your deficit grows, and it just becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the deadline was June 30th of last year, to be honest. The new deadline, for all intents and purposes, I think the Senate breaks in November because of the election. So they're running out of runway. I would say they have a couple of weeks to get this done.
Jay, I'm sure you're watching this all play out in Harrisburg. What concerns you about possible potential cuts to SEPTA service if the legislature can't reach a deal here?
Because this is not the first time. I think that's what concerns me the most, is that SEPTA has been here a number of times. On my Boulevard Subway Twitter page, I shared a few news clippings from the Inquirer from the early 90s talking about the cutbacks to streetcar service that SEPTA proposed because they wanted to, be as slim and trim as possible on the budget. And, it ended up creating a situation where SEPTA did eventually abandon these North Philadelphia streetcar lines because they had to. They didn't have the budget, and they were going back and forth with Harrisburg. And every time SEPTA gets into the situation, they basically lose a limb. And I'm worried that, from judging from the past, that this is another situation where SEPTA is going to take a major L and our region is going to take a major loss. And we got to do everything we can to prevent that.
So can you break down your project that you have been working on for some time? Tell us about your dream for the Roosevelt Boulevard subway.
So, I would, of course, want to call this the dream of the community. Northeast, in a feverish way, really wants the Roosevelt Boulevard subway done. This started for myself about 3-4 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was in a class with Leslie Richards, CEO of SEPTA. Yeah, she was my professor at Penn.
And former head of transportation at the state.
That's true, too. Long story short, I was able to get a document that was detailing the study from 1999 to 2003. And from that document, I was able to look at the daily ridership numbers and the economic development benefits and, cutting down on congestion. And I thought, why not build this project? Why isn't this something that we should be aspiring to? And what I've discovered over time is that it has been something that the city has aspired to multiple times, but due to very intricate decision making and sometimes a lack of funding, the project hasn't moved forward. But today we're in a situation where we have the infrastructure law, we have the Inflation Act, there's the Build America Bureau, there is TIFIA 49, there is countless amounts of grants and funding formulas that we can use to create tens of thousands of jobs here, building the subway and induce economic growth and development in Northeast. It's good for the health of the city. It's good for the health of the region. It's going to make Roosevelt Boulevard much safer than it is today. We want to turn the boulevard of death into the boulevard of life.
So you just mentioned that there's grants, there's opportunities, some type of urgency to fund something like this. Where does it stand now? How much of what is happening in Harrisburg in the coming weeks, like we were just talking with Lauren about, will affect whether this project ever comes to fruition?
Absolutely. So I have to clarify that it's a Pennsylvania Department of Transportation project, but SEPTA is a partner. But at the same time, we need a confident SEPTA. We need a well-funded SEPTA. And if we look at the past and look at similar situations where SEPTA was in a budget crunch, you know, at the same time, there were projects that could have been built that would have benefited the entire region. You know, you had in the 90s the cross-county metro, which would have went from Paoli and cut across all the way to Trenton. The Schuylkill Valley Metro. So people have a short attention span and they cannot remember that these projects were put on the boards and then they were later put on the shelf. We can't afford to do that anymore. We've had at least 3 to 4 decades now of transit stagnation. This region really hasn't built anything new since the Center City commuter connection, and that opened in the mid-'80s, I think 1984, if I'm not mistaken. If the time is now to turn the page, focus on making Philadelphia much more pedestrian friendly and community centered, and build out a transit system that connects our neighborhoods. You know, Philadelphia is way too big to have a metro system this small. You know, we need something that's really going to be a connector of communities rather than a divider that's Roosevelt Boulevard today.
More news of the week after the break.
Isn't the point of traveling to get away from it all? To feel the best you've ever felt? Then maybe you should check out Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool, white, sandy beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll meet locals brimming with gratitude for an island that redefines what a paradise can be. When your trip comes to an end, you won't need another vacation because you just had the vacation. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
So I want to get back to what you were mentioning at the top of the show, Lauren. Why won't Republican legislators who live in other parts of the state support SEPTA? You wrote on X this week that there's just a lack of understanding about Philly from the legislatures.
Yeah, again, I think a lot of people they're very quick to jump and say it's Philly malice. It's, despite the city. And I think for a small percentage of them that may be true, but I do think there's just a general lack of appreciation and understanding of how many people ride the system and rely on it just for their day-to-day lives. I shared an anecdote. I used to work in the Michael Nutter administration, and the Commerce Department every year would invite all of the state legislators to Philadelphia for a weekend, and they'd take them on a tour of the city, and they'd show them where RACP, the capital program money that the state gives out, where all of the state money that was going for development, they would take them around to the projects to say, hey, this is what this money's building. And I'm on a trolley with a state legislator from middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, and we were stopped at a red light, and there were probably like 10 or so people waiting for either the bus or the trolley. And he turns to me and he says, what are those people doing, standing around? What are they waiting for? And I said, they're waiting for the bus. And he was like, oh my God, that many people ride the bus? And, this is a dozen people on a Saturday afternoon. This is not, outside of MSB during rush hour on a weekday. So I truly think for a lot of them, they just do not understand how integral SEPTA is to the lifeblood of the city. I think there's also just some general political ideology involved where there's this idea that government should be turning a profit, like whether it's the post office or whether it's Amtrak, that these systems should be able to kind of carry their own weight and not be subsidized by taxpayers. And it's just an impossibility. And then these systems are economic engines. These help drive tax dollars into the government coffers. And then I think the last piece is just this idea that Philadelphia is, always coming to the state looking for resources, looking for money. And so while a lot of legislators see us there with our hands out, they don't necessarily look at the other side of the ledger about all of the economic activity that the city generates for the state, all the tax dollars that the city, puts into the state. And I think, a combination of those things is why there's some sort of hesitance. And as Jay pointed out, This is not the first time SEPTA has been in this position. So I think after a while, legislators almost feel like, oh, Philly's back again. It's the boy who cried wolf again. So there's a hesitance from legislators to continue to open up the purse strings to give us resources, even though they are desperately needed. And these tax dollars are more than going to pay itself back.
Right. But you're talking about former Philadelphia Mayor Michael Nutter, but then we had Jim Kenney. So time has passed, right? So why is that ideology, like you mentioned, why is that like kind of like a dark cloud around us? So Jay, like what's your strategy to try to convince lawmakers SEPTA is important, that people need a Roosevelt Boulevard subway?
Number one would be looking at the different counties and how much money SEPTA generates in that region or that county. I think that would be it. But I think, coming back to what Lauren was saying, going back to the days where we invited these different state senators and state reps, to come to Philly and look at projects that the state is funding and showing that, Philly is neither wasteful or not ready to, accept these billions of dollars. It's a good investment. Philly is one of the best investments you could have in the Commonwealth. But in order to bridge that gap, we have to meet halfway. And I think that sometimes we forget how large the Commonwealth is and that this is a massive state. And I think putting on our shoes for a day or two and bringing more of them out here would be helpful. But what I will say at the same time is that elections matter, getting to the ballot matters, and, looking at, potential elections that are coming up, maybe we'll have a more amicable state senate that'd be more willing to help SEPTA get to a place where projects like the Roosevelt Boulevard subway can happen successfully. I think it's long overdue, but I would like to not have this conversation 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Right.
We need a permanent solution to funding for not only SEPTA, but even PRT and the different larger transit systems throughout the Commonwealth.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Jay said, there needs to be a paradigm shift at the legislature where they stop thinking as public transit as a drain on resources, and they think about it as what it is, which is jobs and economic development. The public transportation is the engine of our commerce, and we need to invest in that.
We've got more news after the break. Lauren, meanwhile, instead of building public transit, the Inquirer reported this week that the state wants to widen I-95. Okay, you're rolling your eyes. What do you make of this?
I think I'm not surprised. I think when you look at PennDOT, as Jay mentioned, the Roosevelt Boulevard subway would be essentially a PennDOT project. There's car supremacy when it comes to that transportation agency. Vehicular traffic is number one. I think it's really telling that they sort of announced this project without actually having talked to anybody in the city before they announced this widening project. And, you have this concept of induced demand. Like, we've been widening highways for the 70 years since we built the interstate system, and we still have traffic because if you build it, more cars will come. And so I would really love to see the state take a look at that money that they're going to spend on, widening I-95 and look at how that could be better used to get fewer people on I-95 through, strengthening our public transportation system options in the region.
Jay, do you want a wider 95?
Personally, I don't think I-95 belongs on Philadelphia's waterfront. But personally, looking at what this project would do to I-95, and including putting a ramp through a baseball field, I just don't think, it makes sense to widen I-95. At this point, we should, of course, maintain it as is. But there's other, ways that PennDOT can be reducing vehicle miles traveled. And that's by putting more money and putting more dollars toward multimodality, whether that's active transportation like biking or scooters, but putting more money into transportation. Let's be real. If we built the Roosevelt Boulevard subway extension, that would be thousands of people that are enticed to not drive on Roosevelt Boulevard, which we know is a death trap, and to not take I-95, which is a vehicle for commerce, interstate commerce. So it would be a win-win for not only, the state and city, but the country, because we want I-95 to be fast and to get our commerce through there. So, maybe if less of our community members use I-95 and we're on a subway, it would be a way to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. It's 2024. And I think the idea of widening a highway in a city that has an amazing urban fabric like Philadelphia is backward thinking. But I'm not surprised coming from, a state department that was known as the Department of Roads. We have to be real. A lot of state departments of transportation are road building monsters. That's all they know how to do. And there's an old guard in a lot of these departments of transportation that will not give up the engineering focused mindset of induced demands. They are addicted. They are fully addicted. And it only changes through new people taking these positions or communities standing up and saying, we don't want these expansions. And I'm very certain that if they try to build this expansion, do things like destroy the Rizzo rink, you're not going to see a happy South Philadelphia. You're going to see a community come out and heavily protest this highway, just like they did when they built it in the first place.
Shifting gears, Lauren, there was a really interesting political moment this week, and I was wondering how it's playing out with the whole SEPTA funding issue. Johnny Doherty, who was once perhaps the most powerful labor leaders in Philly as the head of the Electrical Workers Union, is headed to prison this week to serve his 6-year sentence for his bribery and embezzlement conviction. How does this political moment shape how Harrisburg looks at us?
I think with Doherty sort of being taken out of the leadership position a couple years ago, I wouldn't say there's a vacuum. I think there's other folks that have kind of stepped in to fill that leadership role. But in terms of just pure influence, Philadelphia definitely has lost one of its biggest cheerleaders in that regard. And someone who was politically active and engaged on both sides of the aisle, who had relationships with Republicans and Democrats. I think a lot of the times when we think of labor and trades, we think, purely Democrat. But one of the things that made Doherty so powerful was that he would get involved in races all across the state, was hugely influential. I definitely think it's had some impact in terms of some of the relationships across the aisle just aren't as strong or there anymore, and that may be impacting where our current status is.
All right, that was Lauren Vitas, government and political consultant and the owner of Enact Strategies, and Jay Arzu, doctoral candidate in urban planning at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you both so much for joining me this week on CityCast Philly.
Trinae, thank you for having me. Looking forward to coming back again.
Great to be on, Trinae. Thank you so much.
It's time for the tip of the week, where we share a life hack for living in Philly. Homeowners, you now have until Monday, November 18th, to file an appeal to the city's assessed value of your home. According to the Inquirer, the original deadline was this upcoming Monday, October 7th, but that has been extended after concerns that people needed more time to make appeals. Remember, this assessment determines how much you pay in property taxes, which are due by March 2025. You can read more about how to submit your appeal by clicking the link in the show notes. If you have a tip of the week, we'd love to hear from you too. Call or text us at 215-259-8170. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. Our executive producer is Matt Katz. Our producers are Abby Fritz and Adam Sage. Our Hey Philly newsletter editor is Asha Prihar. And our host is me, Trinae Nuri. Music is by Philly's own Interminable, with additional music from All the Kimonos and James Weldon. If you enjoyed this week of episodes, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter, Hey Philly. We'll be back Monday morning with more news from around the city. Have a great weekend and be safe, y'all. Bye.